Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Let's just dive right in. Today we're taking Chapter 2 of Ag Fakiti's Language Testing and Assessment, which covers theoretical and methodological considerations, and we're turning it into a master's level study session. I'm your host and resident language assessment expert. And to keep things super grounded and practical, I'm joined by two awesome co-hosts.
Hey there, I'm the postgraduate student. My job today is to help unpack the actual academic theories, the models, and all those citations that really ground our professional practice.
And I'm the novice teacher. I'm currently teaching an EAL class, English as an Additional Language, and frankly, I am desperately trying to figure out how to design fair, effective classroom assessments based on all this dense theory.
Fantastic. Together, we're going to systematically break down these chapter concepts and frameworks and translate the theory into clear, actionable takeaways. So, the absolute crux of this entire session really boils down to three big takeaways. Number one, theory grounds all our assessment decisions. We absolutely must have a clear theory of language ability.
Right. And number two, assessment tasks have to perfectly align with the specific language constructs we're actually trying to measure.
And number three, which I think is a big one for me, test scores aren't just numbers in a gradebook. They require really careful interpretation based on learner characteristics, methods, and the context of the test. Okay, here's our mental roadmap for today's mini-lecture. We're going to start with theory and language constructs, move through the historical models of language ability, tackle alignment and tasks, break down measurement perspectives, and finally, look at contextual dimensions. Let's get going.
All right, Section 1, Theory and Language Constructs. Basically, defining exactly what it is we intend to measure. To understand why theory matters, we have to recognize its relationship with assessment practice. Theory guides what we assess, how we assess it, and how we interpret the results to make defensible decisions.
Yeah, and honestly, this is exactly my dilemma right now. I have this EIL midterm coming up. How do I actually know if I'm measuring my students' true English ability rather than just their test-taking skills, or like how well they memorized the textbook last week?
Well, that requires looking at how theories of second language acquisition, or SLA, inform our tests. We have to ask ourselves, are we assessing a short-term learning outcome, like a grammar rule you taught last Tuesday, or are we trying to measure a deeper underlying language ability?
Exactly. Assessment is a core part of the teaching-learning cycle. To figure out what we're actually measuring, we have to clearly define the target. And in assessment terms, we call that target the construct.
Right, so according to the text, a language construct is fundamentally an abstract concept. It's something we can't directly observe. I mean, you can't physically crack open a student's head and see their reading ability or their communicative competence. We can only infer those underlying abilities by systematically observing their language behaviors and how they perform on specific tasks.
And notice the critical gap here. We have observable performance, which is what the student physically writes or says on your midterm, and then we have their actual underlying ability. Our entire job is to bridge that gap accurately so our inferences are valid.
And the thing is that underlying additional language, or AL proficiency, is incredibly complex. If we look at scholars like Bachman and Selsey-Mersha, they explain that it's multi-componential. It's not just one thing. We're looking at organizational competence, which is your grammar and text cohesion, but then there's pragmatic, strategic, interactional, and intercultural competence too. Oh wow, okay, breaking it down into those subconstructs completely changes things for me, like pragmatic competence, using language appropriately in a specific social context. That is huge for my EAL students. If my midterm only tests their grammar, I am completely missing their ability to actually function in the real world. Exactly. And we also have to consider the cognitive processes. What are your learners doing mentally when they respond to your test? Cognitive processing during reading, writing, speaking, and listening means they are actively retrieving organizational knowledge while simultaneously applying those pragmatic rules. We have to build tasks that align with those intended cognitive demands. Okay, moving right along to Section 2, Models of Language Ability. This is the historical evolution of how we define proficiency. Our definitions of language ability have evolved quite a bit over the decades, and this history directly dictates modern test design. Back in the 1970s, the field mostly operated on the unitary L2 traits hypothesis, basically the idea of one general underlying language proficiency. Back then, this usually led to discrete point grammar tests, like really simple multiple-choice vocabulary quizzes. But that shifted dramatically.
In 1980, Canale and Swain proposed communicative competence, which broke proficiency down into grammatical, sociolinguistic, strategic, and discourse components. And then by 1990, Bachman expanded this into highly complex, multi-componential models. So as the academic models shifted from discrete skills to this broader communicative competence, the tests themselves had to shift too, right? Like moving from isolated grammar quizzes to actual performance-based tasks. Precisely. The theoretical model you adopt literally dictates the kind of test you build. You simply cannot test multi-componential communicative competence effectively with just a fill-in-the-blank worksheet. Which brings us nicely to Section 3, Alignment and Tasks. This is where we move from abstract theory to practical classroom application. Okay, I do love the theory, but here's my real-world problem. How do these complex, multi-component models actually dictate the design of my midterm? Like, how do I translate strategic competence into an actual test question? Well, the chapter distinguishes between two types of standards to help with exactly that. Content standards specify what competencies or skills the student should possess, but performance standards dictate the desired level of those competencies. Oh, okay. So for my EAL class, I might use a framework like the ACTFL Proficiency Guidelines to benchmark exactly what intermediate or advanced performance actually looks like for my specific construct. Spot on. Those frameworks define the performance standards, so you can make sure you're measuring the construct at the appropriate cognitive and developmental level for your specific learners. And this brings us to a golden rule of classroom assessment. As the text notes, assessment tasks must match and facilitate both the learning outcomes and the teaching and learning activities. So, if I spent the entire last month doing highly communicative, authentic role plays in class, but then my midterm is just a multiple-choice grammar quiz, they aren't aligned at all. Exactly right. As a teacher, you are constantly trying to balance the authenticity of the task with the practicality of administering and grading it. The context of language use is so important. Authentic tasks, like having them write a real email or navigate a role play, those mirror real-world context. But yes, they're harder to grade than artificial discrete point tasks. But if that alignment fails and you strip away too much context for the sake of an easy grade, your test results become totally meaningless. All right, let's look at Section 4, Measurement Perspectives. This is all about understanding educational measurement and how we interpret those test scores. Let's say you've designed a perfectly aligned task, and now you have a stack of graded midterms on your desk. When we interpret these scores, we generally have two main approaches. Norm-referenced compare students against each other. It's totally relative. Think of it like grading on a curve, where only a top percentage gets an A. Oh, I definitely don't want that. My goal isn't to rank them against each other. I just want to know if they actually mastered the specific ELL learning outcomes we set out to learn. Then you want criterion-referenced evaluation. This approach compares a student's score against absolute criteria or standards, like a set pass-fail threshold. It's outcomes-based, which usually makes it the fairest approach for assessing your specific classroom goals and actually giving you reliable, interpretable scores. But we also have to be really careful about what the score itself actually represents. Classical test theory states that an observed score, the grade on the paper, is made up of a true score, which is the portion reflecting their actual target ability, and an error score. Wait, what causes measurement error? This is where we have to talk about assessment methods and method effects. You could use multiple choice, constructed response essays, interviews, portfolios. The choice of method itself can affect their performance entirely independently of their actual language ability.
Absolutely. This is known as a method effect, or construct-irrelevant variance. If your listening task requires students to write a really long, complex essay simultaneously, a student might fail because they are a slow writer, not because they're a bad listener. The method introduced the error.
Expert, penultimate section. Number 5, contextual and social dimensions, essentially the human elements of testing. Tests simply do not exist in a vacuum. For example, if you're using an interview or a paired speaking task to test interactional competence, that performance is what we call co-constructed. A student's score might depend heavily on how helpful or unhelpful their conversation partner happens to be that day.
Furthermore, we have to account for individual differences among test takers. Every single student brings a totally unique profile to the assessment. We're talking about their innate language aptitude, their background knowledge on a topic, their motivation, affective factors like test anxiety, and of course, their diverse multilingual experiences.
That makes a lot of sense. Like, if a reading passage is about a highly culturally specific topic, a student's background knowledge might artificially inflate their score, which completely masks their true reading ability. Individual differences heavily influence assessment performance.
You know, that makes me really reflect on the stakes of my own midterm. To me, as the teacher, it's just a low-stakes mid-semester check-in. But for an international student taking it, failing might mean they lose a scholarship, or at the very least, they feel incredibly demoralized.
Exactly. The stakes dictate the washback, which is how the test influences the learner's future trajectories, their motivation, and their study habits.
Which just reinforces why assessment is an integral part of the teaching-learning cycle. If your midterm is aligned properly, it creates positive washback, guiding students toward better cognitive processing and much deeper language learning overall.
And finally, Section 6, Takeaways for Assessment Practice. Let's apply this theory directly to our classrooms. To wrap up our study session, let's weave together our 3 big takeaways from Chapter 2 one last time. First, theory grounds our assessment decisions. We absolutely must clearly define the multi-component language constructs we are targeting, understanding the cognitive processes involved. Second, tasks must align with those constructs. We avoid measurement error and method effects by ensuring our tasks are actually measuring the true score, always balancing authenticity with practicality. And third, scores should always be interpreted in context. Using a criterion-referenced approach ensures I'm fairly judging my students against our actual learning outcomes, while fully respecting their individual differences and the real-world stakes of the assessment. So, we're going to leave you with this final provocative thought to evaluate your own practice. Look at the tests you give. Are your classroom assessments genuinely measuring true underlying language ability, or are you just measuring their test-taking skills and method effects? Think about it, check your alignments, and keep learning. Thanks so much for joining us on this explainer.